this is a state prerogative, this is something reserved to the states, they're going to lose, they're going to fail. And so then just finally, and I think this is probably where our panel will spend more of our time, what do we do about this? And in my view, and this is something that the paper states in the Strongman and some other writing takes up, I think it's really important to think about ways that states can challenge the federal executive, the president and the executive branch in particular, and that therefore don't rely on separation, on separate spheres, but rather on the deep integration of states into national governance. So just by way of quick examples, on the one hand, you have the defensive kind of approaches. You mentioned the National Guard litigation, for example. On the one hand, that's this very classic kind of federalism confrontation, the federal government mobilizing National Guard in states over the opposition of governors. But the ways the states resist that is not to say, they do say this, but this is not how they win, that we have a 10th Amendment, a federalism claim against this. They say this exercise by the federal executive violates federal law, right? So it's the executive branch specifically rather than the federal government as a whole. And states are doing this now in a whole variety of areas, focusing on the ways in which the federal executive branch is acting in a lawless manner. And even if Congress won't defend its prerogatives here, the states can come in and defend those prerogatives. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay.
You need to hold it close to
Okay, it just seems to be going to defend those prerogatives for Congress as well as for themselves. And then secondly, in a more affirmative vein, you can see states adopting legislation themselves, right, relying on their sovereign powers, but not in a way that separates them from federal governance, but a way that directly relates. So we mentioned ICE, state adopting laws with respect to masked agents, states adopting laws with respect to sensitive locations like courthouses and arrests, states trying to use their sovereign capacities not to stand apart from the federal government, but to influence how the president and the federal executive branch act. And so there's much more to say about all of that, but maybe just by way of intro, I'll stop there.
Okay. And you introduced a theme that I think you handle very well in the paper, and which also ties in with the theme of overall LibCon this year, which is the difference between defensive things states can do and the areas where they can go on the initiative. And I want to talk about the defensive things because that's often the ones that we do read about in the litigated cases. And there are two doctrines that help the states and that win some cases for them, but that you point out in the article don't go nearly as far, don't protect the states nearly as much as the states might wish. So we'll talk about them one after the other. The first is anti-commandeering. So tell us about that.
So the anti-commandeering doctrine is a doctrine that is associated with the 10th Amendment, although it's not really derived from the 10th Amendment. It's more of a structural precept that says the federal government cannot give orders to the states. It cannot give commands. It emerges in the doctrine actually only really in the 1990s, although there are earlier precursors to it. And at first it arises when the federal government is giving orders to states to adopt legislation and then to have state executive officials carry out federal law. Most recently, the court also said it applies to negative commands to the states. States' orders not to do something. That was the Murphy case about gambling for those who are watching at home. And so that doctrine is important to the states, and it gives them some measure of protection from federal orders. And so it's been most important, I would say, in the Trump administration, as in the first Trump administration, and now with respect to sanctuary jurisdictions and immigration, when the federal government and the Trump administration specifically tries to demand, as it has, that states lend their own resources, their own police, their own executive apparatus to enforcing federal immigration law. The anti-commandeering doctrine is what provides the ability for states to say no, to say we don't want to do that, and we don't have to do that. And in general, states raising these claims now as well as previously against federal efforts to compel their participation in federal immigration enforcement or other federal programs are winning. They win in court when they make these claims because that is a pretty clear-cut violation of the anti-commandeering doctrine.
And that actually ties in with the second doctrine, because one of the coercive methods used by the Trump administration is to threaten massive funding cutoffs of states that have sanctuary laws. And as that gets us to improper spending conditions, where the states also win some, but not as many as they would like cases. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so the spending power is vast power of a federal government that has a lot of money. And one thing that has been recognized for a long time is that the federal government, and specifically Congress, may use its control over money to have the states do things that it would like them to do, and including, importantly, when the federal government does not itself have constitutional authority to adopt a regulatory measure, it can effectively pay the states to adopt that measure. But the court has imposed certain limitations on that spending power, which is a vast power, including that the conditions that Congress wants to attach to the funds must be communicated clearly. There must be notice to the states before they accept the money in return for undertaking that activity, that the funds must be related to the activity for which they are engaged, a couple more, but most importantly in this context, as came out in the litigation about the Affordable Care Act and the Medicaid expansion, the idea that the spending power cannot become coercive. It cannot basically be used effectively to yield commandeering. So if the federal government is giving the states an offer that they can't refuse, the court analogizes it to a gun to the head, right? Then that is an impermissible use of the spending power. And so we have these limitations, but I guess I'll just say, since you teed it up with respect to commandeering and anti-coercion alike, even though these are important limits, and the spending as well as the anti-commandeering doctrine have stopped certain kinds of abusive practices by the federal government, where they really come up short is that the federal government decides to act itself. In the anti-commandeering context, I think Minnesota provides the most vivid example. If instead of asking the states or demanding that the states cooperate, the federal government sends thousands of ICE agents or other DHS agents into a jurisdiction to both target particular individuals and to provide a show of force against an enemy jurisdiction, the anti-commandeering doctrine really doesn't have anything to say about that. If the federal government is attempting to circumvent rather than to rely on the states, then the anti-commandeering doctrine is not an answer. And with the anti-coercion part or the spending clause, generally, likewise, it comes up short if, which is what we're seeing a lot of now, the federal government chooses, instead of trying to impose conditions, simply to cut off funds altogether. I think there's still recourse that comes from the states challenging the executive branch, and again, its lack of compliance with federal law, but they're not federalism points. The anti-coercion and anti-commandeering doctrines as such won't help there.
Okay. And finally, for now, because I'm sure we'll come back to these issues, let's talk a little about the affirmative things that states can do. And you've got a fascinating list. Some of them are, in fact, counter federal programs with state-organized programs like the state co-ops on recommended vaccines, or there's even state cooperation on replacing weather service activities that the federal government has stripped them of. But a lot of the things that they can do affirmatively are simply to sue. And you give a lot of examples. And I want to tee up with one question, and then you can finish, which is a lot of people can sue against authoritarian federal measures. Do states get a special hearing from the courts? Do they get better results than when some victim of the authoritarianism who is private sues?
So I think the answer to that question is a little bit complicated, as I suspect you know from asking it. So in a case 20 years ago now, Massachusetts versus EPA, there was a suggestion that states might receive special solicitude when seeking to have standing to bring challenges in court against the federal executive or otherwise. I think in the years since then, we have seen that states do not really receive special solicitude. What we're seeing right now, actually, I think from the Supreme Court, but not from the lower courts, is almost a special disregard for states as litigants, even when states have the same kinds of injuries and entitlement to sue in court as a private litigant would have. So that's something I think to be concerned about, that maybe states don't deserve special solicitude, but they certainly don't deserve to be penalized vis-a-vis a private litigant. But I think what makes states good litigants in this context is two things. One is the point that they are already deeply integrated into most of these programs. So when the federal government, for example, cuts the CDC budget and stops providing certain kinds of services, that directly harms the state's own efforts to provide those kinds of health services because they've been interwoven with the federal government all these times. And the states have very good litigation shops. We could talk more about state AG's offices, but they have particular resources and particular capacity to bring these suits. So I think there's a litigation front. There's also, as you mentioned, legislation states are adopting to try to preserve lost capacity and otherwise.
And that is the perfect transition because Kasia is managing editor of the Brennan Center's State Court Report, which is this fabulous publication. And in that capacity, your desk, I imagine, as like the O'Hare or Hartsfield Airport of vast numbers of fascinating new developments in the state courts and also the state legislatures, many of which are responding to the extraordinary crisis at the federal level. So I'm going to ask you, we will want to get into some of the ones having to do with ICE in particular. So if you could start by just saying, to what extent do you see states being a bulwark, and in what ways should they try to be more one?
Thank you so much. So what I focus on most in my work is the steady rollback of rights by all branches of the federal government, and like a failure to provide robust rights protection and remedies for violations. So all branches of the federal government right now are guilty of this. Because I have a litigation background, I used to be an appellate attorney at the MacArthur Justice Center, where I focused on prison conditions under the federal Eighth Amendment, and suddenly started to realize, like, oh, this is a really hostile environment to be trying to vindicate the rights of my clients. Oh, wait, what about state constitutions? Most of them have a clause that bars cruel and or unusual punishment. Maybe we can convince them on a state-by-state basis to be more protective. So I do focus more on the judiciary, though, as Walter said, the articles that I edit and that people send in cover, run the gamut in terms of, state laws that can fill gaps or provide expanded protections. But just like quickly starting with the judiciary, I think most people in this room, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, probably are disappointed in some of the protections that the U.S. Supreme Court has announced or failed to announce. The very obvious example that I think pops into everybody's head first is the Dobbs decision, which announced that there was no federal constitutional right to abortion, and just, sent all of these cases to state courts under state constitutions. And we've just seen dozens of cases that announced more robust protections for reproductive rights and or amendments. But, if you're somebody who cares about government takings, the Supreme Court has said that private development can fulfill a public use requirement for government takings purposes, but over 40 states have repudiated that. Very recently, in the trans rights context, the Montana Supreme Court held that a state ban on gender-affirming care for minors there violated their explicit right to privacy in their state constitution. And just a few months later, Scrimeti came down, which held that it was not an equal protection violation for a state to have a law like that. And so the list just goes on and on and on of ways that state courts and state constitutions are more protective than what than the protections offered to us by the federal constitution as interpreted by SCOTUS.
Good. And for those of you who are interested in learning to use state constitutions to secure rights that you think may not be covered, you will find a wonderful ideological pedigree of Justice Brennan himself was known in his later years for going around as the Supreme Court was reversing some of the things the Warren Court did and saying, let's have state courts take up the slack, but also one of the most respected conservative judges, Jeffrey Sabun, of the 6th District, has written a wonderful book. I think it was called 50 Imperfect Solutions about state constitutions. So this has crossover appeal. You can reach often justices on state Supreme Courts, not necessarily the ones that you might think with these sorts of arguments. So let me pursue it into this area of correcting the ICE and other street brutality, because often when we talk about that and when we cite the instances, and there are now several states that have tried to ban masking or that have tried to create remedies against brutality in state court against federal actors, We hear from the opposition supremacy, federal supremacy, argument over go but it's way more complicated than that, right? Could you tell us a bit?
Sure. So what Walter is referring to is something that we call Congress 1983, which our friends at Protect Democracy have done a lot of work on trying to get states to pass these statutes. And what these statutes are state causes of action against federal officials for violations of the federal Constitution. And so, when I talk about these with people, as Walter said, people say, well, wait, what about federal supremacy? Wouldn't that violate federal supremacy? And the answer is, I think that these statutes are very constitutionally uncontroversial. They're not trying to elevate state law over federal law. They are in fact looking to help enforce federal law. So that is not a supremacy problem. And in fact, there's an extremely long history going back all the way to the founding of, this is how state law was how for a very long time federal officials were held accountable for violations. And that really only started to change when the U.S. Supreme Court came down with Bivens in 1971, in which they said that a Brooklyn man named Webster Bivens could sue federal officials for searching his home without a warrant, even though Congress had not explicitly authorized such a lawsuit. And then later on, in 1988, Congress passed the Westfall Act. I think maybe this one is a little bit, if there is a hurdle to Congress 1983, it is the Westfall Act, which says that the Federal Tort Claims Act should be the only remedy against federal officials. However, it has an explicit carve-out for violations of the federal Constitution. So plain text seems like Congress 1983 should be fine, given that carve-out, though at least one federal court of appeals has said that applies, that's a carve-out for Bivens actions rather than for Congress 1983.
And it's going to be the federal courts that have the last word on the breadth of that, right? Is that?
Yeah. Those cases are almost always going to end up in federal court. Even if they start in state court, they're going to end up being removed to federal court.
Two more questions. First, Cato would never forgive me if I did not bring up qualified immunity, which is one of our hobby horses. And that is this doctrine that says basically that you can't sue over a lot of police brutality and also other misconduct by government agents. But in this case, I didn't realize until I read some of what you said, the extent to which states have been able to vary from that otherwise monotonously uniform rule in New Mexico. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So this is a little bit of a complicated issue because it crosses, I'm not going to exclusively talk about Congress 1983, but just in general, when states allow for causes of action for even state constitutional violations, they do not need to import federal style qualified immunity into their doctrine. So that New Mexico recently passed a Civil Rights Act that explicitly said that qualified immunity was not a defense. The courts in California have held that for the Bain Act there, which actually is a Congress 1983 and does provide a cause of action against federal officials as well as state and local officials, that qualified immunity is not a defense. So that really varies. And state constitutions can, like the Montana Constitution has been interpreted by the Montana Supreme Court as barring qualified immunity. So, and then there was an attempt in Ohio to get a ballot measure, a ballot initiative to amend their state constitution to get rid of qualified immunity. I want to back up for 1 second because I realize that some folks here might not kind of understand the need for Congress 1983. Like what we can't already hold these federal officials accountable. Like I can't, if I'm beat up by an ICE official, why can't I sue them? And the answer is that Congress passed Section 1983 to provide a cause of action. This was many, many years ago in the 1870s, to provide a cause of action against state and local officials who violate your federal constitutional rights. But not federal officials. And then Bivens kind of in 1971 started to fill that gap. But Bivens has been, basically confined to its facts, and the U.S. Supreme Court has not really allowed it to go very far beyond that, which leaves this huge gap now where, like, we've seen a call for Congress to step in and act. And, there was just an op-ed in the New York Times by Erwin Chemerinsky calling for, right after Renee Good was killed, calling for like a codification by Congress of Bivens. But the way I see Congress 1983 functioning is like a codification of the promise of Bivens on a state-by-state basis.
Yeah, and I will say a lot of things having to do with what rights you are left with if someone from ICE comes and bashes your teeth out on the street used to be obscure lawyerly stuff that only lawyers really cared. At this point, I would say a whole lot of non-lawyers care about that. Come to our communities.
It was very funny, actually, also to see there was this article by a professor, Killamar, like 40 years ago, that first introduced the idea of Congress 1983. And then a few months ago, the New York Times had an op-ed about this 40-year-old law review article. It was like this moment of like, what is the world becoming? Like, why is there an op-ed about this?
Okay, there is more to say, but I want to turn to Kevin. And this is going to be a different conversation. We are not going to get too sunk into legal specifics, I don't think, because that's not your style of writing. I don't know a damn thing about it. But that doesn't keep you from coming up with some very provocative and interesting opinions. And I'm going to start by quoting one or two of them. I'll quote, "I am very much convinced," this is a context that you describe federal troops occupying Minneapolis like a Hessian garrison. Love those references. But you say, "I am very much convinced the anti-federalists were right." Now, do explain.
Well, that we didn't put sufficient restraints on federal power, and that the executive in particular will always tend to aggrandize and aggregate power to itself, irrespective of the individual, ideologies of the holders of the office, and even irrespective of the character of the people in the office. It's covering the anti-ICE protests in Los Angeles and in Minneapolis. One of the things that was foremost in mind for me was that there's a big difference in the world between what federal agencies are legally or theoretically empowered to do and what they actually can do. And I thought that was particularly, it's black comedy, but it's comical in the case of Minneapolis, where there are these guys out there saying we can't do our jobs because of these, protesters and stuff. And so I'm thinking, you're out here with your rifle and your mask and your tactical underwear, and you can't get anything done because there is a middle-aged feminist poet in a Honda Pilot making fun of you. And that's what and then they shot her and killed her. But there are some practical aspects too. There are these things, I think they're called 287 agreements, where they would come in and they would deputize local police to help out ICE and things like that. States have banned these. And Michigan's an interesting example because Michigan didn't ban these agreements, but some individual counties did. The sheriffs took their own initiatives and said, we're not going to do that. And that's going to be interesting, I think, politically in places like Texas, where you've got this state that's by reputation very conservative, but all of the cities are Democratic, essentially. Or Fort Worth, I guess, is the biggest American city that has elected a Republican mayor currently. Well, Dallas has a Republican mayor, but there's a guy who changed parties. It's kind of a weird situation. But you're going to have these, big cities like Houston and San Antonio and El Paso. I think 7 of the 25 largest cities in the United States are in Texas, and they're not going to want to cooperate on this stuff. And they're in a position to deny these folks some real resources because they don't have jail space to put everyone in they want to arrest. They don't have manpower to do all this stuff. The flip side of that, of course, is that counties and cities and states are going to have their own resources to bring to this problem. I understand the arguments about the coercive nature of the spending power, but I think it's just sort of always that way, and there's no way to neuter it, essentially. But the one way you can practically neuter it is if you have your own resources. If you have, you can't say F you if you don't have FU money, right? And so if you're a state that's got your finances halfway in order, and when the federal government comes in and says we're going to cut off FEMA grants for terrorism stuff unless you adopt our voting rights business, which is something that's currently underway. It's a lot easier to say no to that if you don't actually need the money. If you've got your own resource to throw at it, and I think that'll be a good incentive, I think, for some of these states to get themselves more put together. It was interesting in both of these cases, though, just to see the level of non-cooperation and the way in which it was energetic and had a certain political valence to it. I think that surprised both the Trump administration, maybe even surprised some local people. I think that they were surprised by the intensity of the protests. And being from Texas, I'm a little more used to it's what we used to call border issues. But I remember living in Norwalk, Connecticut, and the first time a billboard in Spanish went up in Norwalk, people kind of freaked out a little bit, and they didn't know that there were like 20,000 Latin Americans living in and around that area. Some of them legal immigrants, some of them illegal immigrants, but people whose language at home wasn't English and who were doing jobs that they didn't think about very much. And I think you've seen some of that in I mean, obviously not in Los Angeles, which is kind of, that's normal life. It is not so much in Minneapolis, I think. One of the things that's made the politics of the immigration enforcement stuff so interesting is that the border is effectively everywhere now because people are very mobile, and we have different sorts of communities and different sorts of integration. But yeah, it's been interesting to see that it's politically valuable for the people who are leading this, that people are actually taking interest in this and saying that that this is something we like in our politicians, to take this issue about our state's interest or our city's interest and understanding these being separate from the federal government. And being conservative, we have an inherently sort of backward-looking political philosophy, which gives us a long memory. And it's been really great, because I am a guy who likes to say, I told you so, to notice all of my kind of lefty progressive friends discovering a strange new respect for federalism. Because I've been telling them for years, we're going to elect somebody one of these days that's going to make you very, very anxious to have a situation in which California and Connecticut and New Jersey don't have to do things the same way as Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana.
One of our friends, I think, in a conservative magazine was coping with a comment from one of the New York DSA candidates that airlines should be a nationalized industry. And he said, please, look around you. If airlines were a nationalized industry, they would be basically used for renditions. And airline service would be suspended entirely rather than just refuge, customs service from sanctuary cities. Yet you do not want to put the power of a nationalized airline industry in the hands of Donald Trump or anyone like him. So,
and I think it's actually been a very healthy part of this whole, I mean, I hate to be a guy who looks for silver linings. I don't really believe in them. But I look for the clouds when there's silver to be found. But the fact that we are having these conversations across the political aisle in which we want to, discover ways to honor some things that are really important, I think, small r Republican values, which is we're a very, very large and diverse and weird country. We're a very strange country. And we're never going to have a situation in which people are happy with this kind of, top-imposed one-size-fits-all model for everything across the country. I think Dobbs is a good example of that. That abortion became an issue that really just brought out a real sense of fanaticism in people, he said, while sitting in a building in which he was once fired from a job for his writing about abortion. But long story. And I understand that this is really a non-negotiable issue for a lot of people. They have very, very strong feelings one way or the other, but irrespective of which side of that you come down on, I think it's a lot politically easier and healthier for society to be able to go down and lobby your state legislature to change its laws than to have to do this 50-year project of, gaming the Supreme Court to get a decision that you want out of it. I think it's just a better way to go about things. And it's also revealed some interesting things, too, like you had this pro-life movement that was built up over 40 years, or 50 years rather, to focused on this one court decision, and then they get their way on it, and they have no idea what they want to do statutorily afterward. And they put down, a bunch of really dumb and badly thought out laws and badly written propositions, and these failed politically. And failure's the useful part, right? I mean, failure's kind of how social evolution works. You put something out there to see if people like it, like a product or a law or a political proposal, And when people reject it, that wasn't so great, we'll try something else. And I think that's a really useful thing to have.
Failure is part of the laboratories of democracy that Brandeis called the states. Okay, one last question, because I know people are waiting for questions and answers, which is, you have lived in India and you have spent a lot of time in Switzerland. And so tell us a little bit about how federalism works in other countries. What are the best cases? Maybe Switzerland. What are the failures we should watch out for? And then we'll go to questions.
Well, Switzerland's probably the best governed country in the world. The key difference between the United States and Switzerland is that Switzerland is full of Swiss people. And the United States is full of maniacs. We're just very different kind of people. The Swiss have this direct democracy thing, and they have this very, very strong sense of federalism. And so, for instance, certain kinds of ballot initiatives not only have to be endorsed by a majority of the population, but also by a majority of the cantons, which are their version of the states. So you can win 60% of the overall population, but if it's all Zurich and Geneva and the countryside doesn't go along with you.
Some of those cantons are teeny tiny.
Teeny tiny. But they also have some really weird rules that I like. So, for instance, if you want to immigrate to Switzerland, I've looked into this. The national government makes the decision about whether you can be an immigrant, but you have to convince your local state government or your local municipal government to let you move there. And so if you want to become a citizen of or a resident of this, suburb of Zurich, I actually went to a hearing there one time of a woman who was looking to do that. And so she had to go down and do an interview in German, which proved she could speak the local language and prove that she was not going to be a financial burden. And this particular lady had lived there for 25 years and spoke pretty good German. And that is how Tina Turner became a Swiss citizen. She had to go down and convince the local city council that she was not going to be a drain on Swiss society. But it's interesting that you have to go down there. And her little town that she lived in is like 1,800 people.
So this was not the J.D. Vance theory that blood and soil was the only legitimate reason for them to take her. Anyway, the audience has been waiting patiently on questions, and so we've got us about 11 minutes, I think, for that.
Let's keep them very brief. All right, to start here with
Cameron Tomino, Deputy Research Director for Digital Ground Game. When we're talking about federalism, part of some of the research I do actually had to do with Supreme Court reform for a while. And I look a lot at the district court level. A lot of my stuff I looked at was coming through the Brennan Center, actually. In the wake of Trump 2, federal courts have been overruled on so many of their decisions. And if you look at the makeup of these courts, they can be from Trump 1, they can be from Bush, they can be from Clinton. Doesn't matter. The Supreme Court, in its current makeup, is overriding them and consolidating this power to 9 justices at the highest level, to the point where we were 1 justice away from losing birthright citizenship, something I think everyone in this room could probably agree is unassailable 2 years ago. What can we do to reinforce the federalism among our court system, even at the federal level or the state level? Yeah.
Any responses?
Well, I have a lot of colleagues that focus only on this. It seems like you've discovered some of their work. One of their key proposals is term limits. I know that feels milquetoast to a lot of people, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Though I know that they've done a lot of deep thinking about all of the various ideas out there, and they've landed on that one as the most workable, and run the numbers and figured out that will eventually result in more less of an anti-majoritarian bend to the court. So that's I would point you towards 18-year term limits. But the other thing is that the reason we started our state constitutionalism project was it was kind of like a double. It was a response to what we saw the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court doing. We were like, okay, there has to be an alternative. So right now it has sort of shifted a little bit to this anti-authoritarianism, how federalism as a bulwark type project, but in the beginning it was a response to the supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Andy Hawks, I'm a local retired attorney. one of the most important ways in which the framers expected the states to control federal power was through the Article 5 amendment process. I know Walter has written about this, and my question to the panel as a whole, is there anything we can or should do to restore the role of the states in the constitutional amendment process?
I would say in the long run, yes, it's not going to be something where you get the consensus of numbers of states in the current polarization, but we should be working on that at a theoretical level. I'm happy to say that 20 years ago or so, Cato published a paper on making the Constitution easier to amend, a topic that came up also this morning at the panel. We should all be looking at those things because the current particular fix we're in will not last forever. Constitutional amendments and interest in changing the Constitution has come in waves over American history. I'm old enough to remember the 60s and 70s where you could get consideration of all sorts of ideas, including some very bad ones, as well as some ones that changed America very dramatically. So let's do the intellectual work, realizing, as with Akhil Amar's paper, that it may be quite a while before the society is ready to consider it.
Hi there. Thank you all so much. Paul Bartek with States' Rights, the State and Local Human Rights Center. As you probably know, the Trump administration has been involved in litigation with some 30 states regarding those states' refusal to turn over unredacted voting lists of voters. The federal government has been asking for federal election records, and yet in virtually all those states, the state voting records are identical lists. In none of those cases have the parties talked about state constitutional protections for state voters regarding free and fair elections or state voter privacy expectations in the information they give the federal government or give the state government. Is that a mistake? Should state constitutional issues be raised in these sorts of cases, which to date they have not been?
If I remember, and I'm sorry, you can. If I remember correctly, the states have won every single case. I think it's up to about 14. So in a sense, it's not broke. They don't necessarily have to fall back to a different level of analysis when the combination of state statutes providing a good and sufficient rational reason for them not to respond, but also the lack of federal statutory authority is winning the cases for them. Again, my role at this point is just to stand on the sidelines and laugh at the administration for having such bad legal theories that they launched this.
I think I agree as a legal matter, but I think there's a separate role that maybe you're suggesting with respect to informing people that they have a state constitution, that they have state constitutional rights. They're not going to prevail if there is a contrary federal statute, even certainly a federal constitutional right, as you know, because of federal supremacy. But there's all sorts of space that the panel's already alluded to in which the federal will recede, at which point the state will be all that's there. And so bringing up the arguments, whether or not in litigation, but just to inform people about the importance and the salience, which is one thing that State Court Report is doing, and that you're doing, I think is independently significant, even though probably not a legal strategy.
And also one area where it is very significant legal strategy is if you've got one of those state governments that sympathizes with the Trump administration and in many cases handed over files, if there is something in the state constitution protective of privacy, then that could totally change the climate for challenge.
But it's just a reminder that the federal government needs things from the states. It needs certain kinds of cooperation, particularly data sharing and things like that. And the states have a real lever that they can use, not just to not cooperate when they're asked for something, but use that in an aggressive sort of way to say that if you don't, negotiate with us on these policy things that we'd like to see done differently, we're going to cut off cooperation with X, Y, and Z things. And I think it's there aren't any states, I think, that are really leaning into that as much as they could right now, but they do have levers they can lean on, and they really should.
All right, got time for just one or two more.
Are there any instances, in fact or in imagination, of states doing things performatively that force the federal government to respond? For instance, could Michigan and Canada decide to open that bridge anyway, no matter what Trump's friend wants? can a Houston policeman pull over an ICE vehicle because it has a broken tail light?
Kasia.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to say that there are examples of this throughout history of, as a general matter, states can, in certain instances, prosecute federal officials for state crimes committed on the job. And there are situations where that's uncontroversial, where it's like, a postal service worker hits somebody with their car because they're speeding. But there have been situations like what you're talking about, where it's kind of like they know that they're not going to prevail, like with the Fugitive Slave Act. Like we saw. No, that's what I'm saying. Like they were like arresting marshals who were in the northern states under, who had a federal authority to be there, but then they were arresting them and like charging them with kidnapping, and then forcing the federal marshals to file habeas petitions in state court. Like they knew that those prosecutions were not going to work, but it was like they were like protest prosecutions. So we've seen instances of that at least throughout, and maybe others have like different examples.
There was a thing in the 19th century where a state could conduct a federal policy back and so on.
All right. We got time for one last question here.
Hello, I'm Blair with Digital Ground Game. I'm the media director. Good to see some of y'all again. I guess my question revolves around, recently the Supreme Court ruled on Lander v. Louisiana Department of Corrections. For those who have more friends than I'll give you a quick reminder. It was where a Rastafarian man was held down and his head was shaved, even though due to his religious practices, the corrections officer should not have been able to do that, and he wanted to sue them. The Supreme Court ruled that they were actually, because the individual officers had not agreed to protect his rights when they received federal funding, then it didn't matter anymore. I guess in this new world where we're kind of reformatting the contract between federal funds and the rights that are protected with those with the strings that are usually attached to those funds, I'd love to hear y'all's perspectives in that situation. I know one possible outcome would be that a lot of my friends probably wouldn't have got to see Puerto Rico, but I'd love to hear other things that y'all are thinking about when we're kind of reconstituting this idea of strings attached to federal money.
Yeah, I mean, I think the decision is it's quite shocking. In some ways, it's less shocking as compared to much of the other litigation that has happened recently, and it flew under the radar, really. So thank you for bringing it up. But I think with respect to the idea that the conditions basically can't be imposed vis-a-vis individuals rather than vis-a-vis the state, that's going to be a serious constraint with respect to federal spending clause and the work that it does in protecting rights. But it makes me think, again, consistent with the tenor of the panel, that the federal solution, at least in the short term, is going to be unavailing, and that it really is therefore going to have to come from states filling those gaps, which states have already started to do before this decision with respect to their own constitutions, their constitutional rights, the limitations on qualified immunity, the ability to file suit independently, given that state and federal constitutions protect a very overlapping set of rights. State constitutions have more, but most rights protected by the federal constitution are also found in state constitutions, and so most rights effectuated through federal statute often also have a state constitutional analog. And so I think in terms of where the work should be to try to protect rights or try to recognize those rights, in the short term at least, it's going to have to be in the states rather than trying to change the spending clause understanding.
Yeah, the spending clause is complicated, and there are some serious arguments often on both sides. And I'll leave it at that, because I looked at Lender and I thought, that this will at some point probably become moot as enough people do the things that Jessica was just describing. But in the meantime, who can you sue for some of these admitted violations in many cases of federal law? I think we're about out of time, but if I could grab the mic in order to ventriloquize Kasia, who wrote one of the nicest things that I wasn't able to ask about in a question, which is about why is it that we should work on state law and state governance and try to make it a good example of democracy actually working in a period in which there is so much depressing at the national level. And part of it is to keep flame going of competent democratic governance And I think that serves not only an inspirational function, many states are competently governed and respect rights, but it also, I hope, serves a percolating function of training a new generation of politicians who could step into and do a better job at federal office.
May I just take 10 seconds to... The thing that I had said about this is that if you look at national polling on all of these issues, like minimum wage, universal background checks for gun ownership, et cetera, like these things poll nationally at like 65, 80% of like the full population of the US. And yet like Congress isn't doing anything about it. Like they're not passing these laws. They're not like meeting what the majority wants. But then you look at the states and you have dozens of states for like each such instance, you have dozens of states that have done what people want. And so I think that it's like an antidote to apathy. And I think it's like an antidote to like lack of trust in democratic institutions, which like a lot of what we're seeing right now that this administration is doing, like that's maybe the most pernicious thing is this like lack of trust. And so whatever we could do to combat that, we should be. And I think states, that there's an answer in states.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you all our panel.